With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, we know this feller, but it has been a long time since we've seen him. It was all the way back to the beginning of the year. It doesn't seem like it. Boy, this 2022 just flew by. Kenneth Schrupp is back. He does all kinds of PR consulting and stuff. He's also a Young Voices contributor. Going to talk a little education today. Kenneth, good to see you again, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me on again, Andrew. It's been a long time.
It's good to see you. How's things out there on the left coast?
Well, we're in for a new mayor most likely here in Los Angeles. Overall, weather is lovely, but crime is up. Roads are falling apart. Homelessness is rampant. I'm happy that things can maybe be turned around.
Yeah. City council people are getting recorded. That kind of happened. That was a little bit of a mess. Let's start there. California is always kind of on the edge of politics, good, bad, or indifferent. It just is. It's, the world's sixth largest economy by itself. It's very populous. You got LA, but then you got, Inland Empire. Then you got NorCal and SoCal, two places that couldn't be any more different if they wanted to be. You being in California, what kind of perspective does that get? We talk about East Coast, West Coast bias and everything from politics to sports to news coverage. What is the kind of the viewpoint of DC and that stuff from sitting out in LA right now? Because I got to imagine it's different. I know I lived in Vegas. Just the time zone alone changes your perspective. Give me your perspective on what's going on in politics just real quick while you got you.
Are you talking about on a national level? Let's just look at Congress. Imagine you're a congressperson and you're in Virginia, you're in New York. You can take the train home every day if you want. You can come visit your constituents whenever you want. Or you can even work mostly out of your home office. If you're in California, it's not really an option. You rarely will come home, or you'll rarely be in DC. Those are your two choices. What this lends itself to is extremely secure leadership that doesn't really have to worry so much about primaries and can go campaign on ridiculous things. So it's no surprise that California's federal legislators are some of the most radical progressives in the country, because they never really have to go home and they don't really have to answer to anyone. As long as they have the D next to the name, they're going to keep winning. So for asking what my perspective on national politics through the lens of California, this is the consequence of a one-party state where you don't have bad ideas, sufficiently challenged by organized opposition.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, and I appreciate you giving it, because we've been covering California a lot. Labor regulation. They're doing cryptocurrency regulation. They got vetoed for odd reasons. Things like that. It always seems to be California pushing the envelope on these things, and that's good perspective. Why? Let's talk a little education. You've been writing about education, something else that, California's got a little different ideas on. I want to start with the big picture concept, because we sure learned this before anyway, but COVID really drove the point home. Education, if you're not having outcome-based education where it's what are these kids actually learning in the education system, there's no amount of money thrown at this system that's going to fix it. And what you're going to be writing about, what we're going to be talking about today, is just another example of it. But big picture-wise, you start looking at, what the illness is, not just the symptoms. Money never, ever solves educational problems. In a lot of cases, it actually ends up making it worse, don't it?
Exactly. I mean, there are a lot of countries that spend far less than we do. We spend the most per student, as far as I know. I might be wrong on that. You might want to double check me. But in California, for example, in the United States, we spend more per student on public school than the average private school charges for tuition. And yet the outcomes are very, very different. Are you telling me that the private school really does have more money when the public schools spend more money, and yet we're having such divergence of outcomes? Money is not the problem. It's really, how are we scoring these kids? How are we engaging with parents? How are we measuring success? And what are we teaching them?
Yeah, you were writing in real clear education. it goes to the heart of this because it's where are you going to put your money? Now we know, people that are advocates of school choice say, hey, we're going to fund the students, not the system. The system advocates are like, well, if you take money out of the system, that hurts everybody. There's good and bad points to all that. There's overlap in the middle. You highlighted something very interesting here where folks were talking about universal cash deposits. And you took the point of view, this really is going to kind of hurt everybody if it goes through the way some people are proposing it.
Right now, the hot idea among the right, for a long time, it was vouchers. Vouchers didn't really take off like people wanted. Um, now people say they support quote unquote school choice. School choice can really mean anything you want it to mean. I have school choice. I can choose to send my kids to public school. I can choose to send my kids to private school. That's school choice. Today, though, people on the right are identifying school choice as temporarily identifying as deciding to give people the money that the state would have otherwise spent on the public school and let them spend it on their own education spending. And that would be a defined amount per state. However much, everyone would get the same amount. There are a lot of problems with this. There are a lot of economic issues, first of all, and there are a lot of social issues. The social issues are the more terrifying ones. The economic ones are just going to be quite bad also. When you create a universal subsidy for something, you increase the price floor, right? So if you have a private school system like now, where enrollment increased significantly in the aftermath of COVID, and parents are looking for new alternatives, these private schools are already at full capacity. So let's say that you have a full private school, you're charging $10,000 a year, and you learn that every single student of yours is going to get $8,000 to spend on education, right? You don't have to exactly spend it on tuition, but most of the ESA money or education savings account, they call them savings accounts to imply that you're saving it. You're not. It's coming from the government. It's a deposit from the government. Let's get that out of the way. That if you're just getting $8,000, they know you're getting $8,000. They're going to raise your tuition by $8,000 because it's not costing them any extra. It's not costing you any extra. They're already full. So what are you going to do? Not pay the $8,000 and not have an extra seat for your kid? It's absurd to think that this is not going to have any impact on prices. We did the exact same thing with colleges. When we created universal student loans, suddenly tuition skyrocketed because you created quality and price agnostic demand. Surprisingly, though, there was no such problem when these student loans were available only to lower and lower middle class people who really needed the money. The problem is when you make these things universal. Once soon as it became universal, tuition went from increasing just 11% faster than inflation to many times faster than inflation. And the same thing will happen with ESAs.
Yeah, Kenneth Schrupp joining us. You mentioned it. The key word here is universal, means you're giving it to everybody. We all know, this big boy adult conversation here. We all understand that if it's not universal, then you got to parse it out. Now you're going to have some type of a means test one way or the other. You're going to have some kind of discrimination one way or the other. And that's where people get really uncomfortable in education because now it feels like you're picking and choosing who gets this money. So this feels like one of those things where it's an either or. And, a lot of things you want to try to reach middle ground on. There doesn't seem like there's going to be a middle ground in here because if you go for a middle ground from universal or not doing it at all, you're just going to end up in picking who gets money and who doesn't. And there's not going to be any kind of equitable, fair, and or non-conflicting way to do that, is there?
No, it's really hard to choose who is needy at that line. There's a family with a household income of $1 million a year, 2 kids. Maybe they probably don't need that subsidy, but a family of maybe $150,000 to $250,000 a year with 4 kids in San Francisco, you might on paper look like you're making really good money, but that money doesn't go very far out there. You might be really pinched. So how do you even? I don't know how you decide who gets and who doesn't get this subsidy. It's insane.
Yeah, and it's one thing to talk about these things in theory and on paper, like, oh, this would really work. We got an example here. You brought it up in your piece. We're going to link to it. Again, read the whole piece. He's got a lot of stuff linked in here too. You want to read all the link stuff. They actually did this down in Arizona. How did it go when the Arizonans tried it?
So this Arizona universal subsidy is newer. It was just passed in July. It was limited to students with financial need only. Now it's been expanded to any family and any student. As could be expected, most of the people signing up already had their kids in private school. So I don't really know. I think it was 70%, 70 to 80%. It was one of those two. Already have their kids in private school. So it's only really improving access for 30% of people. That's still a meaningful improvement, but you're spending all of this money without really significantly increasing enrollment. There's also been academic studies within the United States of areas that have tried this. And let me bring up this quote for you that really is shocking. Universal subsidies, quote, produce price increases, but no change in enrollment. And what's making things even worse is that every single dollar of subsidies raises private school income by more than $1, which means that tuition increases by more than the subsidy because you increase demand so much. Economics do not work out.
Is there good economics for education? Because here's the problem we get into, especially with public education. It's become such, I think COVID proved how we treat education despite the rhetoric. It's a giant jobs program. It's a giant funding program. It's a lot of bureaucracy. How are we ever going to separate that back out? Because until you do that, the money pipeline, and that's what bureaucracy basically revolves around. It's a money pipeline. That's the issue. That's the money pipeline. So anytime you start trying to move money anywhere else, you're going to get pushback. It feels entrenched, and it feels even more entrenched when you look at programs like this. Is like, hey, the entrenchment's actually going to take this, what on paper might be a good idea, and actually amplify the problem.
So there's a few tracks that I probably want to explore with this. The first is what happens with public funding, with public schools. Up until 1965, there was very little federal funding for public schools. In 1965, the Department of Education was able to centralize materials for students and training for teachers in exchange for creating funding, especially in low-performing school areas. As you could expect, though, all that federal money does is prop up very bad schools with terrible outcomes. It's more or less a jobs program for teachers instead of focusing on student outcomes. So that's where all this federal money in education really goes to. But there is a success model. Right next door, there might be a charter school. And these charter schools that use for-profit vendors usually only get about $9,800 per student per year. Remember, public schools on average get $15,000 per student per year. And their educational outcomes are through the roof. So I know you say, well, if you spend more money, education is going to have to be expensive. These charter schools are showing us that education can be affordable and high quality.
Yeah, Kenneth Schrupp joining us. I get into this conversation with our school choice friends often. Look, I've had kids that go to public school. I've had kids go to private school. I'm all for school choice. But you also point out there's areas where even if you have school choice on the ballot or in the law, there may not be another school to choose from. 91%, you raise it in the piece, 91% of all students are still going to go to public school. So the idea that, this is one of those Twitter ain't real life kind of things and Facebook ain't the way reality is. We can talk about school choice. The reality is most kids are still going to go to public school in some form or fashion. So the idea that you can't do the one and ignore the other, these things need to kind of go hand in hand. And I know there's the line out there about how, well, doing one always harms the other, and we can hash that out as well. Any kind of education reform really has to take both in. You're not going to replace the public school system with school choice. And I think that's something we need to address and be upfront about, and then deal with the public school system as it actually exists today. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yes, it is. And I'd also like to maybe introduce a change of terms for you, a more honest term to use. We like to say pretend like charter schools aren't public schools. They are public schools.
Right.
We should instead differentiate between union schools that exist for the benefit of teachers' unions, not the students, and charter schools. Then they all are public schools. So I do support the public school system in as much as I support vastly increasing the number of charter schools that we allow for, shutting down these terrible, failing schools as soon as there are viable alternatives. We can't keep them open.
Yeah. What do we do? That's the charter schools. What about private schools? Because you're going to get into an area. Look, for a long time in this country, most private schools, and most of them are religious of one stripe or another. That's just the reality of it. A lot of them wouldn't take any kind of federal money or federal subsidies because they were afraid of, having some kind of control issues or what the money would be tied to, this sort of thing. That barrier seems to have broken down some. But if we're subsidizing private schools, we're going to have to start having a conversation of what we traditionally think of private schools. You're talking about terminology. That terminology may have to change a little bit as well, right?
It may. If you look at private schools, the reason that they're cost effective is because they can only spend what parents are willing to pay. So that keeps the idea they can only teach what parents are willing to pay to have their kids learn. As soon as you create these government subsidies, what do you think is going to happen to these private schools? It's almost as if these Republicans all believe that they're going to maintain control of government forever, and there's going to be no strings attached to when it comes to ideology or what you must or must not teach these kids. There will become a time when Democrats will take over these state legislatures and use this money, use these subsidies to control the private schools and ruin them.
Yeah. Kenneth Schrupp joining us. Again, another, adult conversation here. Beyond politics, when you have a private school and you're an administrator of a private school or you're on the board of a private school, the vast majority of your bulk time, unless you have some kind of really fat endowment, is in fundraising. You're always scuttling to try to keep the fundraising going because you don't have it. If you introduce subsidies, to loop back to kind of where we started with this, now you've incentivized them to go after these subsidies because look, human nature is undefeated. These people that have to spend 80, 85, 90% of their time fundraising and doing all that, and that just wears you out. Let's all be honest. We've all had to do a kid fundraiser. Imagine doing that for your job, for your school, 365. They're going to look at that as a godsend, and they're going to look at that as the easier path, and that's going to change how they do things. That gets us back to where we started with you talking about the system gets inflated. They're going to start moving their budgets to fit those subsidies directly. That'll change their costs. And now in a private school or a charter school system, you're going to the same problems with the public school where the whole thing's based around funding instead of education. Is that too harsh of a way to look at it?
Not at all. You're just replicating the problems of the union school system and the rest of the education system in our country. We don't want to do that again.
Kenneth Schrupp with us. How do we break this cycle? Because again, we just went over it. The funding has overtaken the education side. I don't think there's any way you could honestly argue that in America. The funding is driving it because, they'll say, it's test score. Yeah, but the test scores are how you get your funding, so it's still funding. How do we break this cycle? Because obviously it takes money to do education. You have to fund it, but the funding is also, it's almost like chemo in a terminal cancer patient. The cure's killing you just a little less fast than the disease is, right? How do we break this cycle, man?
Oh, that's $1 million question. I have one small answer to that. I think there is some truth to what the current crop of school choicers say. And I think that the average household in California pays about $5,000 in taxes a year to the state. If you have kids who are of public school age and you're not sending those kids to public school, you should be able to get the portion of your taxes back. The average household in California pays $5,000 a year in taxes to the state government. Meanwhile, California spends, let's just say, $10,000 of state money per public school pupil. So if you send one of your kids to public school in California, you're already getting a net benefit of $5,000. I'm saying if you are sending your kids to anything outside of the public school system, you should be able to get what the state would have spent on your student deducted from your taxes up to however much you paid in taxes. That means you won't get net $5,000. You just won't have to, you will have, the average household would probably have a net zero tax for the year because they're saving the state $5,000. This would be one way to give people some of their own money back, but not more money than they actually did put in. It would be meaningful savings for many households, but it wouldn't be universal in as much as proportionally scaled to what you put in.
Yeah, Kenneth Schrupp with us. You ended your piece talking about something that I really want to talk about for a second. We try to talk about not just covering the news, but how we talk about it ourselves, just on our social media and with our friends and family. You talk about how politicians on the right, they've latched onto the buzzword of school choice, and they've latched onto the buzzwords in this particular case of, we're going to fund private education, this sort of thing. Give the average person who maybe doesn't know all the philosophy and all the ins and outs of the school debates and maybe doesn't know the full ins and outs of the education system, give them one or two things like, hey, when they use a buzzword, ask them this question to get to the heart of it, whether they know what they're talking about, or do they really understand what school choice is, or are they just saying the words? Or when they talk about subsidizing private K through 12, what's one of the questions or what's one of the lines of thought that they should ask those people to find out if they're really being sincere or if they're just going along with the trend? Like you say, this is a way that this is going to backfire on folks if it's just a willy-nilly thing. How do we talk about it better?
I think a great question to ask people is, what are Democrats going to do to the program if they take power in our state? How can the state use this to control our private schools or our kids' educations? What's your promise to the people of our state to say that this program is going to remain unchanged forever?
There's a thing in policy. It's like, look, if it doesn't work really at least partially well for both sides, it's probably not a great policy to start with. That's probably a good rule of thumb here. Kenneth Schrupp being with us. Let me ask you one last question about this, kind of to loop it back to where we started though. Why do we get so tunnel visioned with education? Because here we are again, like, I understand the kid part of it and the parent part of it, and people just get nuts about their kids. You got to give people a little grace when they're talking about their kids because they just lose a little bit of reason. I understand that. Why can we not see our education system as an education system? We see it as a political thing. We see it as all this other stuff. What is it with us that's wrong with us that we can't just look at the education system and just make it an education system?
Because we think emotionally about everything. We want our education system to do everything that we as parents have sometimes failed to do. We want our education system to teach our children the values that we're supposed to actually be teaching them at home. We want the education system to teach our kids essential life skills that whether taxes, accounting, job skills, citizenship, all the things that society used to do outside of the school and government. We're just offloading the responsibilities of everything onto the school system. I'm talking with some of my friends who do teach in the public school system. If you're a teacher, you have to you're playing therapist. You're trying to help people deal with major issues inside their home. People don't know anything about like the food they eat. Like it's truly abysmal what's happened with education outside of the school. So now we have to decide that the school must do everything for us all at once, and schools aren't made for that, and they can't do that. So that's one aspect of it, because you'll do anything for your kids, but what if you don't know how to teach your kid anything? Parents are just vastly incompetent these days. They don't have time to learn how to do the things that parents used to do because they're working two jobs to afford ever increasing costs of housing and healthcare. So that's one aspect of it. Another, I think, is a lot of these school choice people care about the consequences. These are people who want politicians elected for just 2-year cycles, and they'll climb their way up the ladder in politics and never have to deal with the consequences. They're going to have so much money that they don't care if their private school gets 50% more expensive. They'll be able to pay for it. They can afford to pay past the consequences of their policies. All they want are votes. You know who the real swing voters in America are? Smart suburban women. And if you're going up and you're telling them, I'm going to give you $10,000 for each of your students so that they can go to a better school because we supported locking down your schools, because we supported destroying the curriculum with DEI and all sorts of nonsense, eliminating AP classes because AP is racist. You tell these people that you're just going to give them money and they'll forget about everything you did to them. It's a vote buying scheme. Let's not forget that.
Yeah. Money corrupts everything, even education. Kenneth Schrupp with us. This is a conversation I think we're going to keep having over and over again. Look, my parents are both public school teachers for their entire careers. Education is just something I've always been around. I've watched it change over the years. And of course, now as a parent and my kids are, almost done with school, I've already got one out of college and the youngest are in high school. COVID really broke people's perceptions of the education system. And I don't think we've really reckoned with folks how they've seen everything since then, because we told everybody in America what we thought about education, but I don't know that the education system realizes it just yet.
Well, that's what the school board elections are for.
Yeah.
Public schools educate 91% of our students, and we can't act like just sending them to private school is going to solve the problem.
Nope. And not everybody has that option. We need to keep that in mind because this gets elitist really, really quick. Very, very few people can homeschool their kids. That's a gift if you're able to do that and do it well. I don't have that gift. I learned that during COVID the hard way, even with the school support. So everybody can probably do a little better on their rhetoric on this thing as we try to find better ways forward. Kenneth Schrupp, always enjoy talking. It won't be as long next time we get you back. I promise that. We already talked about that. We're going to get you back on again. Let folks know where they can follow you and keep up with you until we get you back on Hertel again, my friend.
Oh, easiest way to follow me would be to go on Twitter and type in Kenneth Schrupp. Schrupp is spelled SCHRUPP, and I'll come right up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, enjoy the chat. He's got a couple different pieces floating around right now. Check them out. We'll link to all this and also to his page. Kenneth, it's a pleasure, buddy. We'll do it again soon.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you.